Hi, I'm Alex Idris, and thanks for joining us for another Boldmethod Live VFR. Today we're going to talk about the induction system. And we're going to talk about how it works. We're going to talk kind of specifically about a carbureting or a carburetor-based induction system, though if you have some questions about fuel injection, throw that in there as well. But we're going to talk about how it works, how you lean, how your cylinders are getting fuel, how your mixture affects the way your engine runs, why it might run rough, why we run lean or rich of peak, and also why carburetor icing is a problem, especially as we start to get into fall and the temperatures start to come a little bit down. So tonight we've got Corey Comerick running the chat. If you have any questions about what I'm talking about tonight, as I said, we're going to be a little bit more on the carbureted side. The two, carbureted and fuel injected are fairly close, but tonight's focus is a little bit more carbureted side. But if you do have any questions about fuel injection systems, throw them out there. Corey will forward them over to Colin, our technical director tonight, and he will get them worked into the presentation. The key thing here is obviously this is supposed to be interactive, so don't save everything to the end. And I know a lot of you are kind of new to flying or new to engine management, especially today. When I grew up, we did not have to work on the car. The car, for the most part, ran itself. When my dad grew up, they were always working on the engine. So he had a really great understanding of engines, or has. I, on the other hand, I learned all mine through aviation. And a lot of people getting into flying right now, you've never really spent a lot of time around engines. You're not quite sure how they work. So I want to make sure I'm hitting your questions. For those of you who are really familiar with the induction system, with carburetors and stuff like that, don't be afraid to throw out some of the more advanced questions. I'll do my best to answer those as well. I'm not a mechanic, but I can hold a screwdriver pretty well. So from there, we'll jump into the show, and we're going to start by just kind of looking at a basic engine diagram. So we'll go to the iPad. Okay, what you can see right here is the basic carbureted engine diagram. And I'm going to point out a couple of these parts. Again, for some of you, this might seem really basic, but if you've never really spent much time with an engine, this definitely helps. We're using a Cessna 172 here, though many of the 172, 82 models, and I know the newer 172s are fuel injected, but the concept is still similar. You've got an air intake right here at the bottom of the cowl. That brings in your induction air. And induction air is the air that is used to mix with fuel and burn in the cylinders. It's your fresh air. So it's going to come through the bottom of the cowl in this case. There's an air filter there. Then it flows up through the carburetor. In this case, this carburetor is what we call an updraft style carburetor. And that's because you can see that the air flowing through it is an updraft. It's moving up. And then from there, it flows through the induction manifold into your cylinders, going through the intake valves. You can see this red manifold coming off right here. That's your exhaust manifold. So once the fuel's been burned in the cylinder, the exhaust valve opens, and then that hot exhaust gas passes out through the exhaust manifold. Okay, this is not a carbureted engine. This is our Cirrus SR22. It's a turbocharged fuel-injected engine, but the concept here that I'm going to show you is the same. Oftentimes, when you're new to engines and you're looking at the engine, trying to figure out where your intake manifold is and where your exhaust manifold is, it's really easy to tell the difference because the intake manifold looks new and shiny. You can see here, this engine had about 75 hours on it, so it's still very new, but you can see how the intake manifold does not look like it's gotten hot. And so it still has that kind of silver metal appearance. The exhaust manifold is right here, coming off the bottom of the engine. You can see it go out. This is actually the turbocharger that it's going out through, the turbine section of it, and then it's going out through the exhaust right here. And you can see, I'll zoom in here a little bit. You can see how dark that is. Okay, that right there, that's from heat. Essentially, it's superheating that exhaust manifold. And then in this case, it's passing out the bottom. So if we look at something like a Cessna 172, it's a little less heat. So you notice this is a little less it's got a little less of the kind of cooked look to it. But your exhaust manifold's coming out here and your air intake is coming in here. And so that's the first thing to think about. When you look at our intake and induction system, it's bringing in that natural air, whatever our outside air is. It might heat up a little bit if we have a supercharger or a turbocharger on there. That'll compress it and warm it, but it never gets incredibly hot. And so because of that, it's really never going to, change the color of that intake manifold. So if you're looking at an engine, it looks silver, that's the intake manifold. Once it comes out of the cylinder, once it's been burned, those EGTs are fairly hot. Okay, so, on our aircraft, that easily can get up to 1700 degrees. Normally it's a little less, somewhere between 1330, probably about 1590. But that exhaust gas, that's 1590 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot. And as it moves out, it's going to start to turn that exhaust manifold kind of a dark brown or give it that burned look. And you'll notice the same thing's true in your car. If you look at your exhaust pipes there, they start to turn dark brown as well. Okay. So let's go back. Let's talk about the carburetor. That's where the fuel and the air are going to mix. And again, we said on most airplanes, you'll find an updraft style carburetor. Most airplanes, you'll find a single carburetor to supply all of the cylinders as opposed to multiple carburetors. And they're meant to be very, very simple. So when we look at this carburetor here, you got a couple different parts. You got the part that holds the fuel right here. This is the float chamber. This is where fuel from your fuel pump comes in. And it holds this little reservoir of fuel there, basically kind of to stabilize the fuel flow. So there's always fuel available to get into that induction airstream. The induction air flows up through the carburetor. And you can see there's this little nozzle right here. It's a discharge nozzle. It flies through what looks like a venturi. The fuel or the air does, which is exactly that, a venturi, by this butterfly or throttle valve, and then up. Okay, so the question is, how does this start mixing fuel in? Well, the first thing is you notice that we have a venturi here. So let's just ignore the fuel itself and imagine what's happening. As the air starts to move in, it's going to speed up as it goes through the center of that venturi nozzle. And so, or that venturi area. So if we look at that, essentially if you imagine the air is coming in like this, and it accelerates right here. And what do we know about that? Well, we know that if the air comes in at normal pressure here, as that air accelerates, it's going to drop, so it now has lower static pressure right there. And then as it moves out, it'll move back into kind of its original, let's see, normal pressure as it exits the throttle. So what's really happening here is we're creating this region of low pressure right at that venturi. Okay, looks like we got our first question.
All right, starting off here, Jack's got kind of a good overhead question. I wanted to throw this in since you're just going through the overview. He says, is there any advantage of fuel injection over carburetors, and do many planes still have these carburetors?
First of all, there absolutely is an advantage to fuel injection. One of the best advantages to fuel injection is the fact that you can get very even amounts of fuel to each cylinder. We're going to take a look at why carbureted engines struggle with that. In a carbureted engine, as you start to move back away from the first few cylinders, typically the mixture becomes a little bit leaner. It receives hotter air, and the fuel-air mixture ratio is a little bit leaner. So the cylinders are all running at slightly different power levels. When you use fuel injection, you can meter the same amount of fuel into each cylinder. At the same time, a fuel-injected engine is oftentimes a little bit heavier. It is significantly more complicated, and it can be very difficult to hot start. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But when you look at aircraft, you'll find quite a few carbureted aircraft that are still out there, both in the training world and just the flying general aviation world. In fact, you'll find a lot of original 172s. If you're flying the 172s from the 80s, 70s, 60s, those engines are typically carbureted. If you're flying any of the older airplanes, you're going to find typically carbureted engines. And you can find very high power carbureted engines, and you can find very high power fuel injected engines. So when you look at it, you say which design is better. Fuel injection offers some big advantages in the fact that we can get an even amount of fuel to each cylinder. So it's going to allow you to generate possibly the most power at the leanest fuel burn, okay? But it is a more complicated and more expensive engine, and it is also harder to start when it's hot. And that can be really frustrating if you've ever been stuck on the ramp trying to hot start a fuel-injected engine. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Looks like we got another question.
Okay, next up, and I don't mean to throw you under the bus, but I wanted to at least throw this out here. Rich Gross says this, and Rich, by the way, has been a long-time reader, so thanks for throwing out the question. What does the word mean? What does it mean to carburate something? I don't know, but I just wanted to throw it out to you to see if you maybe knew.
I have no idea, so that's something I'm going to have to look up. I know what a carburetor is, but I do not know where the word comes from. Maybe Corey can research that and text it to us, and we can jump back in the middle of the presentation.
We'll do exactly that. We'll get Tim on that and see if we can get an answer before the end.
I don't know where that word comes from, but the carburetor is. We'll go back to this diagram. It's this thing that is drawn right here. It's a system for mixing the fuel in the air. And again, when we talk about this as being very simple, when you look at fuel injection, the process of both metering and distributing the fuel is very accurate, but it is much more complex. And we'll do a separate show on exactly how fuel injectors work. There are quite a few different kinds, but when you look at the carbureted engine, it is incredibly simple. And that's because you can see we've got this low pressure air that's being created in the center of the venturi. And we have this little discharge nozzle here. Now, this is not pressurized. It's not pushing fuel out. It's not spraying. There's no force behind it. Really, there's just this little float chamber of fuel. And again, it doesn't hold a lot of fuel, maybe a couple cups at the most, okay? And it's got essentially this little fuel tube or fuel line that leads up into the discharge nozzle. And then what's pulling the fuel out? It's that low pressure in the center of the venturi. That low pressure is creating suction, and it's actually sucking the fuel out of the discharge nozzle. So that's a difference when we talk about a fuel injection system versus a carbureted system. A fuel injection system, first of all, is going to move those injectors very close to the intake valves on the cylinders. So each cylinder gets its own nozzle or its own injector. But the other thing is a fuel injection system actually is pushing and spraying fuel at those cylinders. And so it needs a system to both provide that pressure and to regulate that. Whereas a carburetor isn't pushing anything. It's using the natural suction of the air as it goes through the venturi to suck the fuel, essentially, out of that discharge nozzle. So that's why carburetors are very, very simple systems. That's why you find them on simple engines and on earliest engines, or some of the earliest engines, and they're very reliable. Okay, so let's talk about how, as we move or throttle in an airplane, how that's going to change the amount of fuel and air. Of course, when we talk about engine power, there's a couple things that can change it, but one of the biggest ones is adding more fuel-air mixture into the cylinder, right? And so that's what the carburetor does. It allows you to regulate the amount of fuel and air mixture that's going into the cylinder. As a pilot, most of the time when we're flying, the thing that we're moving is a throttle. And the throttle is just regulating the amount of air that passes through the carburetor. And then the carburetor's low pressure zone in that venturi, that's what's actually doing the sucking to pull the fuel out. So let's take a look at that. So in this animation, what you can see here is our throttle is all the way out, completely closed. And you can see our butterfly valve, or the throttle valve right here, itself is also completely closed. So there's really no airflow that is able to move up and through the carburetor. It stops right here, okay? But as we start to bring our throttle in, you can see that this butterfly valve basically starts to move, and it continues to move all the way, it turns vertical, allowing the most airflow. And what's happening there is that airflow starts to pick up and move faster and faster. The low pressure zone that's happening right here gets stronger and stronger, and more fuel is sucked out of that discharge nozzle. So essentially, by opening up that throttle valve, we're going to create the largest amount, the fastest airflow, the largest amount of pressure drop right here in the venturi, and that's going to pull the most fuel out. Okay, so this is a really common question that we get, and one of those is, when I'm sitting on the ground, okay, how is there air moving through my carburetor? Because I don't have any impact air hitting the airplane. You know, it makes sense if you look at a Cessna 172, a lot of Cessnas, a lot of airplanes themselves, they have that air filter, or the ram air scoop, is right on the front of the engine, right? Like the Cirrus, everybody's got that. It's right there. So the airflow, you would imagine, is getting pushed up and into the intake. And that does happen, okay? That happens in flight. But really, it's not that air is getting rammed into the intake. It's actually getting sucked by the engine itself. And so when you're sitting on the ground and you go to start the engine, you hit the starter switch and you use that battery to spin the crankshaft that's essentially, you know, spinning a wheel that's geared to the crankshaft, and now all of a sudden you're spinning the cylinders. As that cylinder starts to draw down, or as the piston starts to draw down in the cylinder, it starts to suck air, okay? It's just like pulling like a plunger on a needle or something. It's sucking air in. And so now it's actually sucking air in through the carburetor. So when you think about it, when we're trying to figure out, okay, so how does that airflow start? It's the engine itself and the suction that it generates that's starting to pull air in through that carburetor. And initially, you know, it's sucking very slowly and it's just getting a little bit of fuel and air mixture. But as soon as that engine fires and it goes up to RPM, maybe 1,000 RPM, then it's generating a lot of suction. It's moving a lot of air through the engine. And so it's sucking that air in through the air filter and in through the carburetor and then up into the intake manifold. Now, one of the advantages you might hear about ram air scoops or modifications to try to ram air into the air filter, that improves the engine's efficiency. The more it has to suck, the more energy that is lost just trying to pull the air in, the less power the engine can develop. The more fuel you're going to need to get to the same amount of power. So you'll find some Cal modifications out there in the STC market or designs of engines to try to improve the amount of ram air in flight so that essentially you're using as little suction as possible. The engine has to suck as little as possible, and the airflow of flight itself is just kind of contributing to that intake. But that's how the air gets up and through the carburetor. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Actually, not a question, but we do have a definition for carburetor. So I put it up on the screen. I'll just read it out here. This came from Corey, and it says, the word carburetor comes from the French carbure, meaning carbide. Carbure means to combine with carbon. In fuel chemistry, the term has a more specific meaning of increasing the carbon content of a fluid by mixing it with a volatile hydrocarbon. So there you have it.
There you have it. That makes sense. So the hydrocarbon's fuel, and the fluid in this case is air. I never knew that. Okay, so now let's talk about, you see how the throttle itself is increasing that airflow, and that's increasing the amount of fuel that mixes because the faster the air is moving through the carburetor, the more suction there is in the venturi, and the more fuel that gets pulled out. But we also have a mixture control. So what's that do? So essentially, let's leave, in this case, the throttle valve all the way open. And what you can see here is, you know, the amount of fuel and air mixture is described just by the amount of red you see here. You can see this little stick. This is actually a little needle. And this needle is going to move down and restrict this little fuel tube that's coming out of the flow chamber. So right now we're operating full rich. And let's take a look at what happens as we start to pull the mixture control back. You can see that as the mixture control moves back, we move towards lean. This needle comes down and restricts the amount of fuel that can flow through this tube. And at the same time then, it makes it more difficult to leave the discharge nozzle. There's less fuel that's able to leave the discharge nozzle, and so the fuel-air mixture becomes more lean. And that goes all the way till we hit the idle cutoff point, where there's no more fuel that's able, or the fuel is not able to mix with the air at all. It's important to keep in mind that the Venturi itself could supply significantly more fuel than the engine can handle. And if you've ever thought about how hard it is to start an engine, the problem is there's a fairly narrow range of amount of fuel and air mixture, the ratio of fuel to air that will actually burn. Okay, if it gets too rich, it won't ignite. If it gets too lean, there's not enough there to create power, and it won't ignite as well. And so there's a fairly narrow window. And when these carburetors are designed and adjusted, they're essentially adjusted so that at full rich, the engine will start and run normal at sea level. Okay, but as we start to climb, everything there starts to change. And that's where leaning starts to come in. So essentially, when we're leaning, what we're trying to do is compensate so that we're staying at the correct fuel-air mixture. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But looks like we've got another question.
Okay, the next question comes from Dimitri, and I think this is where you're going on the slides, which is why I'm putting this up here. Dimitri says, when you're having issues starting an engine, how does pumping the throttle help?
Great question, Dimitri. And so if anybody in the audience has actually driven an older carbureted car, something from the 70s or the 80s, if you've got an 80s Bronco or something like that, you may occasionally pump the accelerator to try to get the car started. In fact, I was just driving an 82 Mercedes convertible at a friend's place in Grand Forks, and to start it, you pump the accelerator a couple times and you spun it up. What you're really doing there is kind of, you're punching a little bit of fuel in through the carburetor. And it really was never intended as a way to prime the engine, but what it really was made for is a way to keep the engine running when you move the throttle quickly. Okay, so when let's say we're recovering from a stall in flight and you get a little overly aggressive, especially on a cold day in the winter, and you really jam that throttle forward. I know we all know that we're supposed to bring it in easily. It's easier for the engine. You're not gonna damage anything, but you get just really excited and you shove that throttle forward very, very quickly. What happens to the engine? It dies out. Okay, you'll hear it cough, right? And what's happening there is the fuel-air mixture is briefly becoming too lean. And so when we take a look at what's happening, I'm going to go back to that throttle animation. If we take a look at this throttle animation, the real problem is if this throttle if the butterfly valve flies open immediately, it actually takes time for the fuel to start getting pulled out of the discharge nozzle. It does not happen immediately. So essentially, you can move this throttle valve so quickly that the discharge nozzle and the low pressure suction doesn't have enough time to get to its stable level of fuel. And so what happens is very briefly, you're going to find if we throw it open, it'll be lean. Okay, so it's got too much air and not enough fuel, and then over a few seconds, it will richen back up again, and now you have the correct amount of fuel and air. But during that brief period of time, the engine's mixture, as you shot that throttle forward, is too lean, and the engine's going to start to cut out. So they developed a system basically called an accelerator pump to try to prevent that from happening. Again, you're still supposed to be smooth with the throttle, but if you jam it in, they've kind of found a way to fix that. And what they're doing there, if you can take a look, this is the accelerator pump on the side. It's got a small reservoir of fuel or access to fuel. And so as the throttle valve opens, essentially the accelerator pump opens up and sprays just a little bit of fuel into the throttle. So you can see it's spraying fuel before the discharge nozzle is able to stabilize the mixture. And then the accelerator pump will close. And there's a couple different designs to these accelerator pumps. Some of them are spring-loaded, and so when you move the throttle quickly, tension on the spring changes, and it pops open and it sprays in some fuel. Others use like a little plunger. So essentially, if you're pushing it in very slowly, the plunger goes down, the fluid kind of just moves away. But if you slam that throttle forward, the plunger goes down quickly and splashes or sprays fuel into the throttle body. Either way, essentially they only function when the throttle moves up quickly. So what's happening when you're pumping the throttle to start the engine? If you were to do it on a fuel-injected engine, nothing. But on a carbureted engine, what you're doing is you're basically just shoving that accelerator pump. You got to move the throttle quickly. So, you 1, 2, okay? And that's basically activating the accelerator pump, which is just pumping a little bit of fuel into the throttle body of the carburetor. So that fuel is typically, if we go back to the iPad, it's going to come out and maybe sit kind of in this area here, inside the carburetor. It's not making it all the way to the cylinders. It's just spraying a little bit of fuel. And of course, if you do it, without the engine running, it's just going to sit here in the bottom. And then once you start cranking, you're going to pull air through it, and that will then evaporate that fuel, and the fuel will make its way to the cylinders. So when you see people pumping the throttle, what you're essentially doing is squirting a little bit of fuel with the accelerator pump into the carburetor's body. As you start to crank, air comes through, absorbs that fuel, vaporizes the fuel, and it travels to the cylinders. You do want to be careful. When we prime, we typically prime up at the cylinders. And I think I've got a slide of that. Let's take a look. Yeah, right here, carburetor-based priming. Typically, you'll have one or more primer lines, and they prime in the intake manifold just before the cylinder here. Okay, so if you could imagine, there's a little intake valve right here, and the primer just sprays a little bit of fuel, just a little fuel mist, right here in front of the cylinder. Some engines will only prime one cylinder. Other engines prime several. It's generally easier to start when several engines are primed, or several cylinders are primed. Okay, so when you're priming, it's getting that fuel right by the cylinder and in the intake manifold. When you're pumping the throttle, it's leaving the fuel in the carburetor's throttle body. One of the concerns is if you pump that throttle too much, you can end up with a significant amount of fuel that's now pooled in the carburetor's throttle body. And so if you were to have an engine fire during start, that fire could move down and quickly access the fuel that is just sitting there in the bottom of the carburetor. The other problem is that fuel can drain down through the carburetor and start to soak your air filter. And so again, if you have an engine fire during start, that's going to flow all the way down through the carburetor, light the air filter on fire, and it can be really difficult to put out. So again, there's nothing wrong with priming with the throttle a couple times. It's just one of those things that once you've done it a couple times, you don't want to keep doing it again and again, or you'll end up with lots of fuel pooled inside your carburetor. Okay, next question.
All right, next up, Massimo wants to know, how does carburetor heat work and when should it be used?
Okay, let's talk about that. Before we dive into carburetor heat, let's just talk about why that's even needed. Okay, so right here, carburetor icing, right? It's a good picture of what happens when your carburetor starts to ice up. You can see that ice builds up on the side of the carburetor's throttle, the throat essentially, and it builds up on the throttle valve itself. The interesting thing about this ice is it only happens in carbureted engines. It does not happen in fuel-injected engines. And here's why. What the carburetor is doing is it's essentially vaporizing this fuel right here in this low pressure zone. So you have liquid fuel that comes out and it evaporates and vaporizes into the air. Okay, so to do that, we're essentially moving fuel from a lower energy state, liquid, into a higher energy state, gas. Okay, that's what's happening. It's going from a liquid to a gas. So we're adding some energy into the fuel, which means we've got to take energy from something to do that. And what it's doing is it's sucking heat out of the air itself. And so, I mean, you could see this at work if you've been down in Florida or Texas or somewhere in the summer where they have misters. You'll see like misters set up on a deck and they're spraying like a water mist. You never really get wet, but it feels a lot cooler. And that's because the process of evaporating the liquid, it takes energy to turn that water into water vapor or into a gas, and that energy is coming from the air, so the air cools down. So the problem we run into is as we start to vaporize that fuel in the carburetor, the temperature of the air drops. And if it drops too much, it ends up below freezing, And now you can start to, first of all, you'll get condensation because the temperature is dropping, but the amount of water is staying the same in the air. So the dew point and the temperature are converging. That could cause some dew to form at warm temperatures in your carburetor. But if that air starts to drop below freezing, now that dew or that moisture that's precipitating out of the air in your carburetor will actually start to freeze, and it'll freeze onto the throat and it'll freeze onto the throttle body. Okay, so let's take a look at the temperature range really quick, and then we'll take a look at how carburetor heat works. And so when we look at the temperature range, essentially this blue zone right here, you can pick up icing at glide and cruise power. And you can see it starts at about 10 degrees and Fahrenheit, which is fairly cold, but it's got a fairly narrow range here. Okay, you really need, if you think about it, you really need quite a bit of moisture in the air. And it goes all the way up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, in the orange zone, you can get serious icing at glide power. In the red zone, you can get serious icing at cruise power. And then there's a very small zone where you can get icing in pressure type carburetors. Pressure type carburetors were carburetors developed during the 1940s by Bendix King. Essentially, they use a completely different design to inject the fuel, and so because of that, you don't get nearly as much cooling during evaporation, and you don't end up getting the ice buildup. They basically avoid the ice buildup, and they're really kind of an early version of fuel injection. In fact, they became the Bendix fuel injection system, but you would find them on a lot of World War II aircraft and then on GA aircraft after World War II. The interesting thing about carburetor ice is it's not that you need cold temperatures. Okay, you really just need a lot of moisture in the air. And so that's why we always talk about kind of carburetor ice isn't a winter problem per se. It can happen during the winter. But in the winter, the air is so cold that it really can't hold much water vapor. Okay, even though it might be saturated, it doesn't have the ability to hold a lot of water vapor, which is why if you've ever been in North Dakota in the middle of the winter when it's 40 below, you'll notice there are no clouds. It doesn't really snow because there's just no water vapor in the air. But as the air starts to get warmer and warmer and warmer, it can hold more water vapor. And so when you start to look at these temperature ranges, like for example, for serious cruise or glide icing, they start at about 25 degrees ambient Fahrenheit, and they go all the way up to 90 degrees. And the serious icing at full cruise power up to 60 degrees. So really, that's why I say this is something to watch, especially during the fall and the spring, because we're operating in these temperature ranges. You know, when it's extremely hot here at 100 and 110, you know, any serious icing is very unlikely. And when it's extremely cold, 10 or below in Fahrenheit, any serious icing is extremely unlikely. But when you're kind of in that middle temperature range, that's where icing really starts to become a problem. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Jason wants to know, does the fuel ever freeze in a carburetor?
Fuel shouldn't freeze. Normally, fuel won't freeze at all. You'd probably have to get extremely cold, like beyond what you would see on Earth for it to actually start to freeze. What can happen sometimes is if there's water in your fuel, that can precipitate out in the form of ice crystals or liquid, and you'll catch that in your fuel drains and your fuel sumps. And so sometimes people hear about de-icing additive that's added to jet fuel, and that's typically because jets both fuel up where it's warm and then end up flying at areas where it's extremely cold, -50. And so the water will precipitate out of the fuel. The colder the fuel gets, just like the air, the less water it can hold. So that water starts to come out. And in a turbine engine, they can separate liquid water. But the problem is if it comes out as ice crystals, those ice crystals, which are solid, will actually block the fuel filters and can starve the engine of fuel. So they'll put a de-icing additive into the fuel, but it's not to keep the fuel from freezing, it's to keep the water suspended in the fuel so it's not coming out as ice crystals and starting to clog up fuel filters. But normally your fuel itself would never freeze.
And I actually just did a quick search here on the ExxonMobil site. What they say is 100 low lead will not freeze above minus 58 Celsius. So it'd have to be really, really
It'd have to
cold
be
to even
really,
get
really
close.
cold. It'd have to be, there you go, really cold. So if we go back to this, again, you could see these ranges are pretty big. Again, they kind of correlate to me with fall, spring, and some summer temperatures. And one of the things that people will think about, when you look at carburetor icing in carbureted airplanes, is that each airplane has different instructions on when to turn on carb heat. Okay, so for example, some airplanes will tell you to turn on carburetor heat anytime the temperature is maybe less than 60 and your power setting is less than 1700 RPM. Other aircraft, like the Piper Warrior, oftentimes tell you only turn on carburetor heat when icing is suspected. Okay, so even if it's the exact same engine, manufacturers can have different guidance as to when you would use carburetor heat, whether you should use it as a preventive technique, starting to run warm air through the carburetor even before you've accumulated ice, or whether you should just wait until you start to pick it up. So the question is why? And the answer is kind of based off of how carb heat works. So let's take a look at that. So right here you've got your carburetor. You've got your exhaust manifold right here, and you've got this little shroud around it. Okay, so this is very hot. We're going to say somewhere between 1300, maybe 1600 degrees. And so you've got the ability to heat air. Okay, and so what happens is carburetor heat basically just takes air from around this exhaust shroud, and then it bypasses your air filter and runs that hot air into your carburetor. Okay, so the concept here is now we're going to warm up that airflow so warm that even though the carburetor is cooling the air is still going to be well above freezing. Okay, so that means A, it can't form any ice, and B, if it's well above freezing, any ice that's accumulated in the throttle body or on that valve will start to melt off. Okay, so essentially, carb heat's just taking air that's been warmed up by the exhaust shroud,
There you go.
bypassing your air intake, and then or your filter, and then going straight into the carburetor. And again, it's so warm that even though the carburetor is still cooling it down, it's still going to be above freezing. It's warm enough to prevent it from causing ice and to get rid of any ice that's inside your throttle body. Okay, so why do some airplanes have different instructions when it comes to use of carb heat? It's because depending on the design of the cowl and the airflow and the engine, the same carburetor could be completely susceptible to ice at different temperature ranges. So for example, you could have the exact same engine, let's say in a Cessna and a Piper, okay, with the same carburetor, but based off the intake design and the airflow, the air that hits the carburetor can be completely different temperatures, and so therefore may be more or less likely to start to form ice. So when you look at something like a Cessna 172, an older one that uses a carbureted engine, you look at a Piper Warrior with a carbureted engine, maybe a Luscombe with a carbureted engine, you look at all of them and they have completely different instructions on when to use carb heat. It's because when the manufacturer is designing that airplane and testing it, they're looking at how the airflow interacts with the rest of the engine, how it's warmed up as it goes through the carburetor, and when it's most likely to start to pick up ice. And so that's why when you're transitioning between airplanes, and a lot of us like to fly a lot of different types of airplanes, especially in carbureted airplanes, it's really important to get into the POH and to learn when the manufacturer wants you to turn on carb heat. There's quite a few accidents that have happened because someone's flying an airplane where the manufacturer says turn on carb heat in these temperature and power ranges, and they just left that carb heat off, and that ice starts to accumulate, and they don't realize it till it's too late, and they're not able to heat the air enough to get that carburetor clear. Okay, we got another question.
Good question here. Are there sensors to detect freezing in a carburetor?
I'm sure there are, but I've never heard of any on general aviation aircraft. I know that, when we go to carburetor icing, actually this was a big deal for the U.S. military during World War II and all the way basically through the end of the big radial engines. And carburetor icing, especially if you look at like the B-36, which had those pusher engines with the jet engines on the outside, because the flow of air was turned around, in the pusher engines as opposed to, the engine was meant to be mounted traditionally on the B36, but they mounted it backwards so it pushes. And so because of that, the carburetor ends up in the very front, and so it gets cold air and it never gets warmed, and so that airplane really would ice up badly, as opposed to had they mounted it as a tractor or a traditional engine with the prop out in front, then it bathes the carburetor in warm air. But I know there could be some ice detection systems in some of those airplanes, but in GA, the only ice detection system is typically us. And so what are we looking for? Well, we have another question. Is it on that point?
No, actually, just keep going with what you're doing.
Okay. So essentially, the way you're going to pick up carburetor ice is you're going to notice a decrease in power. And that's because you're constricting that throttle body. Let's go back, and if you look at the actual icing, you can see what's happening now is the carburetor is allowing less and less air through. And as that air, essentially as that air volume starts to drop, your engine power is going to drop. So it's really important to monitor your engine's power and to make sure that that's not changing without you intentionally doing something. So in an RPM-based aircraft, you'd typically be looking to see that your RPM stays stable and you're not inching in more power. In a manifold pressure-based aircraft, your RPMs are typically constant speed prop. They're going to stay the same until your engine's about done. But you'll see your manifold pressure start to drop. And so again, you really want to pay attention to that engine and monitor if you start to see your power going down. If you're having to add a little bit of power to keep the engine running, that's your first sign of carburetor icing. Okay? You're not going to feel it or hear it until it gets really bad. Once it's really started to choke off your carburetor, then your engine's going to start to run rough. And it's running rough because it just can't get enough air and fuel anymore. And so that's why you're starting to pick it up. But by that time, you've got some serious icing. So, one of the things that I noticed when I was in training, especially when I was practicing maneuvers, getting my instrument rating, just learning how to be an instructor, I would set the power, and you really don't think about it very much. You're focused on a million other things. Now that we spend a lot of time flying around, we use the Cirrus to travel in meetings and stuff, and I spend a lot of time in cruise, I am very aware of what my cylinder head temperatures are, my exhaust gas temperatures are, my turbine inlet temperature, the power that the engine's generating, the manifold pressure it's at. I mean, these days, with our modern indicating systems, you can tell within 1/10 of an inch. And as soon as that starts to change, I'm typically starting to compensate and ask myself what's going on. Again, normally it's just atmospheric changes, but you want to be monitoring that. Again, that's one of the things that we kind of miss sometimes in early training because we've got a lot of other distractions, but that's our first sign of carburetor icing. And then last but not least, once you bring that carburetor heat in, you're going to start to melt out the ice. And so now the ice is going to turn into water. It's going to go through your cylinders, and the cylinders are going to run rough. And that's because you're adding water to the fuel, and not the kind of water to the fuel that you might use to add power in some car engines, but just way too much water. So you're going to hear the engine kind of cough its way through. And if you notice that happening, that means that you had ice and carb heat's working, and you want to leave the carb heat in until everything stabilizes. Also keep in mind, it can take a minute or two for carburetor heat to actually melt the ice. So when you turn it on, you don't want to just sit there and go, oh, nothing's happening, I'll turn it off. Turn it on and leave it on for a couple of minutes and see what changes. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Okay, I put a couple of them together here because I think they'll kind of mesh well. And the questions are, is it better to just leave carb heat on whenever icing is suspected? And then part 2, how long does it take to clear out carb ice?
So part 1 depends on the engine manufacturer or the design of the airplane. And you'll find some airplanes where they say turn on carb heat in these conditions. And so in that case, absolutely yes. In other aircraft, the design of the carburetor, the design of the airflow and the heat, you're really not as susceptible to icing. So they'll say turn it on if carburetor icing is suspected. In that case, I would turn it on only when you start to pick it up. Again, follow your manufacturer's recommendations. The second part, how long does it take to clear? It can take several minutes. It can take a few minutes just to get the carburetor ice melting. And so again, when you turn it on, you don't want to just turn it on, wait for a second, nope, didn't hear anything, turn it off. Leave it on for a while, a couple minutes, see what's happening, give the engine a chance to start to melt the ice out. The reason you don't want to leave carburetor heat on indefinitely is that it bypasses that air filter. So now you have unfiltered air. You're going to get any dust that's in the atmosphere. That gets basically sucked in through the cylinders, mixed in with the oil, so the oil gets dirtier much faster. It'll get trapped in the oil filter. It wears the cylinders a little bit more. Again, not enough that if you're just using it normally in flight, there's going to be a problem. Okay, so that's why, testing it's not a problem. Using it normally in flight's not a problem. But if you were to leave it on all the time, you're essentially going to be bringing a lot of dirt into the engine. It's going to wear faster. Okay, next question.
Okay, Jason wants to know, could the ice damage the carburetor itself?
I'd imagine at some point in time you could get to the point where the throttle valve itself might get frozen to the wall and you could possibly bend or damage something moving the throttle linkage. But by that time, you're going to have so much ice in the carburetor that essentially you're going to have killed the engine. And in fact, if you look at carburetor icing accidents, when the NTSB investigates them, they don't find evidence of carburetor icing. What they find is nothing. They find an engine that seems to be working just properly. And then when you look at the temperature and the atmosphere, they go, well, this was conductive to carburetor icing. We have a normal engine, everything's working properly. The temperature range was inside the carburetor icing temperature range, and the carburetor heat wasn't being used. So that's basically how they identify carburetor icing as an accident cause. Okay, next question.
Okay, switching gears here just a little bit. We have a whole bunch of questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I'm not sure we'll be able to get through all of them, though. But Wes wants to know this. Should you lean for taxi?
Okay, so let's talk about leaning. As we said, when your carburetor is designed essentially, and this is also true with the fuel-injected engine. So at this point in time, what we're going to talk about applies to fuel-injected and carburetor engines, and we can kind of move past how the fuel's mixed and actually get into what's happening. They're designed and set up by both the factory and your mechanics so that at sea level, you can start and run them on full rich, okay? And that provides kind of that optimum takeoff, climb, fuel-air mixture, okay? As we get into cruise, we'll want to lean it out, okay? But for ground operation, takeoff and climb at sea level, it's designed so that at full rich, the engine's operating normally. Okay, but as we climb, obviously we start to lose atmospheric pressure, and I'm going to just show you a really quick chart here. So you can see, first of all, the pressure does not decrease evenly. At sea level, if you have 100% atmospheric pressure, it's dropped to 83% by 5,000 feet. The interesting thing that I always like to note is at 18,000 feet, and you could look at this really as density altitude. At 18,000 feet density altitude, you only have half of the air pressure. At 10,000 feet density altitude, you only have 70% of the air pressure. And so because of that, that full rich mixture is essentially way too rich for your climb. You're going to end up with so much fuel that the engine's running rough. So most manufacturers recommend that you begin leaning a normally aspirated airplane above 3,000 feet density altitude. And again, it really should be DA. We just say 3,000 feet and everybody looks at the altimeter and says, okay, if I'm at 2,500, then I'm below 3,000 feet. But again, the airplane doesn't care how high you actually are. It's just how high it feels. So density altitude's really kind of what I would use there. And that's a point where, if you're running full rich, you're not going to be able to generate full takeoff power. And the other problem is you can start to foul the spark plugs. And so again, if you're taxiing around at 3,000 feet, leaning it out a little bit can help prevent that. The easiest way you can identify this is if you're going in, if you're bringing the aircraft into maintenance with rough running engine, or when you're doing your mag check, you're getting big drops between the left or the right mag. That indicates that those spark plugs have started to become fouled. And typically, when I see a foul plug, the number one reason I see it is typically rich mixtures, low RPMs in taxi, where you're not burning all the fuel and it's leaving a deposit on that spark plug. And so again, about 3,000 feet is where they typically say that's where we should start leaning the engine out in a normally aspirated airplane. If you lean it out below 3,000 feet, the risk is you're using fuel to cool the engine. And if you start to lean out for power below 3,000 feet during climb, the engine still may be getting more than enough fuel to climb at full power, but the cylinder head temperatures will start to rise very quickly. And so because of that, you can overheat the engine. That's why you don't really want to lean it out at sea level for takeoff climb. Possibly taxi to keep it running smooth, but not for takeoff and climb because you could overheat the engine. Okay, so we get this question a lot, and that is, how am I supposed to lean when I'm above 3,000 feet? And the answer is really, you're going to run that engine up to your run-up power, or if you're having a hard time getting full power after that, bring it all the way up to full power, and then we're going to lean out the engine. And keep in mind, both fuel-injected and carbureted systems take time to react. So you want to be slow with that mixture. The example that we've got here is for a fixed pitch prop. So we're going to be looking at RPMs as an indication of engine power. But we'll talk about manifold pressure in a second. So in this case, you can see as we've started our throttle up, we're right at 2,500 RPM. And you're going to see us start to move this mixture back from full rich. So as we do that, you'll notice RPMs start to rise. And then they kind of stabilize for a second, and then they drop off. Okay, and you can see they'll drop off fairly, let's watch that. They stabilize, and then they really start to drop off. And so what you'll do is after they start to drop, once you start to see them come down, you're just going to bring that mixture in a little bit until your RPM comes back to that peak value. One of the problems that I have seen, especially in Denver, when we have people who come in from areas at much lower density altitude, is they struggle to get that engine to generate. It will never generate full sea level power, but you want to get at least the full 8,000 foot density altitude power out of it. Okay, it still will never get to your full power at sea level. And one of the reasons they have a hard time getting to that is because they don't always have enough power in as you're leaning the engine. So if you're leaning at maybe 1,700 RPM, but then you find you're just not getting the takeoff power, try bringing it all the way up to takeoff power when you lean it. Make sure you're on the brakes and lean it out there and take your time. Okay, so you saw that with an RPM gauge. If you have a constant speed propeller, you can just use manifold pressure. You're looking for the exact same thing. You're going to see the manifold pressure start to rise, and then it's going to kind of hold, and then it will start to drop. And you'll just bring that mixture back in rich until you get to the hold point. And again, it's not a super precise value. You'll find you have a little play there, but you just bring it back to that peak point. Okay, looks like we've got another question.
Okay, we got time for one, maybe two questions, but we'll go with this one. Oh, and I had the wrong question up there, so I'm just going to read it off. Actually, let's see if I can get this to update. Give me just 1 second. There we go. Scott wants to know, what does turning the fuel pump on do to my Cessna 172?
That's a great question. Okay, so on airplanes, we typically have two different fuel pumps on an airplane. The first one is your engine-driven fuel pump, and the second one is your electrical or your boost fuel pump. Okay, that's on a typical piston engine aircraft. And so essentially your engine-driven fuel pump should be able to supply enough fuel to keep the engine running in normal flight. Okay, it'll keep the engine going, but it doesn't always have enough pressure to start the engine. So you know, because it's moving so slowly, it's geared to the engine. So when the engine's just turning over, it's really not pumping much fuel. So you'll typically use that boost or auxiliary or electric pump to supply enough fuel pressure to the engine during starting. And then also, that electric pump can sometimes act as a backup to the engine-driven fuel pump if it was to fail, though not every airplane's electric fuel pump can supply enough fuel to keep the engine running. Sometimes, you know, the engine-driven fuel pump needs to be there to keep the engine running. And then the third thing that a boost pump can do is it increases the pressure of fuel in the fuel lines above what the engine-driven fuel pump would do. So for example, if I'm in flight at high altitude, typically this happens in turbocharged airplanes, at high altitude where the air pressure is very low, and I've just climbed up and my fuel is very warm. Okay, so I got really warm fuel and I've got really low outside air pressure, maybe 25,000 feet. Okay, the warmer the fuel is, the easier it is to evaporate, At 25,000 feet, it evaporates much easier than it does at sea level. And so what can happen is the fuel lines, they can actually the fuel can start to vaporize at high altitude in those fuel lines. So as opposed to liquid fuel in the fuel lines, now we start to get kind of this liquid gas mixture. And the best way to fix that is to add pressure onto the fuel lines. As we pressurize the fuel, we keep it a liquid, okay? Essentially, it can't turn back into a gas. And so on turbocharged airplanes, typically we have boost and high boost. And boost or high boost may be necessary to supply enough pressure to those fuel lines so that at high altitude, the fuel is not vaporizing on its own. So that's it. It's essentially, it can be a backup for the engine-driven pump. It supplies fuel and can help prime in a fuel-injected airplane during start. And then in turbocharged and high-altitude airplanes, it increases the fuel pressure in the lines so that the fuel pressure prevents fuel from vaporizing. And then again, oftentimes people say, they look in their POH and it says fuel pump as required. Should I leave it on or turn it off? It really does depend on the airplane design, though a lot of airplanes you can leave the electric boost pump on normal continuously and the engine runs just fine. That's true for the SR22 Turbo. Leaving it on normal causes no problems. And from what we've heard from mechanics, and I don't think anybody definitively knows the answer, most of the wear in the fuel pump comes from spinning it up and spinning it down. So for us, we typically turn the fuel pump on and then leave it on throughout flight unless we need to go to high boost for some reason. But you got to check your POH to see if that would work for you. Okay, that's all the time we have. I wanted to get to leaning tonight, but that's okay. We got a lot of great questions. We will do a separate video, and we'll talk about leaning, EGTs, CHTs, and RPM and power indication, and then even turbine inlet temperatures, rich at peak, lean at peak. That way we can go through all the different things that happen when we lean out an engine. In the comments section, we have a couple links, one of which is to our next show, which will be our IFR show here in a couple minutes, 5 minutes. We're going to talk about procedure names and notes and how to tell what kind of equipment is required for an instrument approach. It's a little trickier than you think. And then there's also a link to send us comments and feedback. We really appreciate it. This subject right here, engine operation, came from people's feedback. So we really look forward to it. I hope to see you in the IFR section. If not, I'll see you in 2 more weeks. Good night.